We'll take a look at a bald eagle project that's been going on since 1961.
The pairs have gone from about 140 pair when I started to over 800 active pairs in a single year in Michigan now.
9 million acres of forest, 1,700 miles of continuous shoreline, 4,300 lakes, 12,000 miles of streams, more than 300 waterfalls, 15 counties, 2 time zones, and 1 area code. Welcome to the Upper Peninsula. Welcome to 906 Outdoors. The bald eagle is the only eagle unique to North America. In the U.S., their numbers were estimated to be between 300,000 and 500,000 in the 1700s. Those numbers declined to as low as 500 nesting pairs in the lower 48 states. Bald eagle numbers have since rebounded, and now the lower 48 boast over 5,000 nesting pairs, with a total of about 70,000 bald eagles in the whole of North America, including Alaska and Canada. The careful and continuous study of bald eagles by specialized groups has led to changes that turned a nearly extinct species into a great American success story.
Great to be back in the UP. I'm originally from Munising, and I started working on bald eagles in 1984 and worked on the Hiawatha National Forest, and then went down to Michigan State after getting my master's at Northern and ended up with a PhD from Michigan State. And what we're doing here is we're working with nestling bald eagles, and this project is a really, really long-term project. We started flying aerial surveys, a guy named Sergei Postchapolsky in 1961. And this is the first year since 1961 we did not do statewide surveys of bald eagles. Our original project here in 1961 in Michigan began with the Continental Bald Eagle Project that the Audubon Society started. And what they did is there were only 485 nest sites of bald eagles in the lower 48 states that they found in 1961. And eventually they were listed on the Endangered Species Act. And when I was on the Northern States Bald Eagle Recovery Team, our area was Maine to Western Maryland to Missouri to Montana. And in those 28 states, we were hoping to have 1,200 breeding pair. And now Minnesota has over 2,500 breeding pair themselves. Wisconsin has the same number, over 2,500. We have over 800 in Michigan. There's over 200 in Ohio. So we have definitely recovered in the species, and that's why they came off the endangered species list.
Sometimes we'll scratch for the safety of the people or the safety of the animals, as much as we want to get the sample after all the effort we've put into it. But sometimes you'll climb 3/4 of the way up and find a branch that is rotten or just not safe to climb. So as much as we want to get that blood sample to check for the pesticides and the feathers to check for mercury, we weren't going to jeopardize the safety of the chicks, so we scratched on this nest. They were just old enough and confident enough that the one was moving out on a branch, and we worry when they're that age, they haven't flown yet, but they can jump and they don't know how to fly and they might go splat. So we decided that for the safety of the birds that we were going to scratch after he climbed all the way up there.
Okay, come here, Jack. I'll hold her.
What happens when we come up to the nest, we have a climber, Terry Grubb, who's been climbing eagle trees since 1968 and is an ex-SEAL. this is a...
About 6 weeks.
After he gets himself belted in up at the nest site, he'll lower one chick to us down to the ground.
Yep, that's fine. Okay, so kneel down.
And this footboard.
Weigh it.
Yeah. So grab that.
So we got 4.3.
Three. No, 3.
We measure them to see whether they're boys or girls, and girls are larger.
He's not very big, actually.
Take out a bag of things so that they can't
Get you.
get you. But
He didn't really come out the normal way. But yeah, he's not too big, actually. Probably a he. You're going to flip him on his back, so here you go.
So I grab the leg.
Grab the hands like I have.
Put your finger
Tight as-
between. Like
but you're
this.
gonna want to put your hand around it this way.
So I grab like.
Yeah. And you can have 2 hands on the feet if you want. You have.
I like to
no,
put a
you have
finger
both
Oh, I don't
legs?
have both of them. Okay, there we
You
go.
see,
you
so
go.
this is 2 legs with your finger kind of between, so you got it.
So now you're gonna want to lay him down on his back. So
with his head facing me.
yeah. No. So yeah. So kind of lean him forward so that you get his side on the ground like this.
Like this.
Yep. And then you want the feet over there.
Oh, okay, feet towards me.
There you go.
And then
Take a quick look and make sure there's no fish hooks or any trauma down his mouth.
I got a weird tongue.
Yeah. That's
Now,
what
see where that opening is there? That's his windpipe. That's the glottis.
Yeah.
So when they're panning, they're staying cool, and you don't want them to not be able to breathe. So this darkness calms them down a little bit. But you want to do it up high so it doesn't
down.
slide off like a sock.
Yeah. So you
And
want to
make
do it
it
as
tight.
tight as you possibly can. Because or else they'll just slide right out of it.
We put a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service band on their left leg, and then we have to rivet that band on or else the eagles will tear that band off. When we band the birds, we've been able to find them, and I think our oldest one here that I've heard of is 38 years in the wild. So when they die, we know where they were hatched, we know how old they are. Sometimes they get hurt in something, or they may get lead poisoning, and if they have a band on, we know where they came from, and then we follow them and track them to see how well they recovered. And sometimes we have color bands, and people can read the color bands, and I had pictures this winter. We put blue color bands on at Voyageurs National Park, and way down in the Quad Cities on the Mississippi River, somebody took pictures of one of those adult eagles with our blue bands from Minnesota. So it's kind of cool. We take some other measurements to find out how old they are. The 8th primary tells us the age of the nestling. And then we also will take a small blood sample out of their wing vein, and that was developed. You saw Jim Sikarsky here, the veterinarian, who's the wildlife veterinarian at Michigan State University Veterinary School. He's the one that helped me develop those techniques so that they were safe for the nestlings. And we collect 3 breast feathers, and we would look at mercury in the feathers. So the blood we use for PCBs, DDT, and other organochlorine pesticides. And also we found Teflon, or also Scotchgard. Those are 2 perfluorinated compounds that were found to be in the environment also more recently in the late 90s.
And it will good, right?
They were chemicals that we had to be concerned about, and they banned them across the U.S. for perfluorinated sulfonate, which is the Scotchgard. The other things that we do after the nestlings are there, we've taken a look at health indicators. We look at genetics to try to take a look at how robust the population is, and we found that they've gone through a big bottleneck during the DDT period, so they're not as diverse as you would think. After we've looked at their general health, is we put them back into the bag, send them back to their home, and they're none worse for the wear. and then they'll be able to fledge at about 12 to 13 weeks out of the egg. So after they hatch, they fly, and they'll either come back to the nest every once in a while, or you may never see them back at the nest. And we've had telemetry on some of the nestlings, and they may go 500 miles from the nest site and then come back. So it's pretty interesting after they fledge. And about 5 years is when they get the white head and tail.
Today's Wild Game Break is brought to you by Cooking Wild Seasonings. Make it fresh, make it yours. Find out more at cookingwildseasonings.com. Here's a look at bluebirds and the houses they live in.
They can have up to 6, but typically they have 5.
Yeah.
And when they have a full clutch of eggs, that's when they start the incubation.
Okay.
The female, she'll lay 1 egg a day, typically in the morning. And it'll take roughly 14 days of incubation. The range is 11 to 19 days. And within 18 days, they'll go from being hatched, featherless, eyes closed, to being completely feathered and able to fly and leave the nest.
Really?
You can tell this is a bluebird nest. The eggs, you could see are blue eggs, but it's an all grass nest. Eastern bluebirds cannot excavate their own cavity. They need a cavity that's either in a dead tree or one that's created through woodpecker activity or through putting the nest boxes out.
When I started in the mid-'80s, we didn't know if the bald eagle would survive. And now the pairs have gone from about 140 pair when I started to over 800 active pairs in a single year in Michigan now. So we have lots and lots of eagles. And the main reason that the eagles have come back is in the early 1970s, William Ruckelshaus, who was the EPA's first director, banned DDT and a lot of different chemicals for use in the environment. And those were the chemicals that were causing the eagles and the peregrine falcons to not be able to reproduce anymore. So banning those chemicals is the reason why we have these eagles around here. And another reason is there was a wildlife biologist on the Chippewa National Forest whose name was John Matheson, and he started guarding the nest sites and making sure that people didn't come into the nests when the nestlings or the adults were sensitive to the human disturbance, and then the adults would abandon the nesting attempts. So we have a lot more eagles now, and they're less shy than they were before. But that's the second reason. We protected habitat, and we had a recovery team. They were on the endangered species list, and they no longer are. So it's a really great recovery story when you take a look at what the Endangered Species Act did. What we're doing here today is we also use them as a monitor of the health of the aquatic environments around our nest sites. Nestling eagles are in their nest sites, and what chemicals are in their blood or in their feathers can tell us what the contamination roughly within a 5-mile radius of that nest site is in the aquatic system, whether it's fish or it's birds or things that they eat that are all associated with the water, except for the occasional dead deer that they find along the side of the road. What we found in the 1980s when we first started doing this project is we found that the chemicals in nestling blood from eagles that lived along the Great Lakes shorelines were 6 times greater in contaminants that were harmful to them than the inland sites. And the citizens of the state of Michigan passed an environmental bond issue. It was called the Clean Michigan Initiative. And so Michigan DEQ has been funding this project, monitoring the health of the aquatic environments across the state of Michigan since 1999. So our funding source for 20 years has been that bond issue. And so we report back to DEQ what we find in the blood and in the feathers of the nestling eagles. Another thing that we found that was really interesting in this long-term study, knowing that we started banning eagles in 1965, And being a good person from Michigan, here's my Michigan. In the northern lower, when we started banding eagles in 1965, the field season would start June 15th. And that's when the nestlings were 6 to 9 weeks of age. Now we started in the northern lower around the 1st of May. So qualitatively, we've seen a 6-week advance in when they nest. We also now have been able to measure how old the nestlings are. So you saw that they were measuring the 8th primary feather, the 3rd big feather in from the tip. That growth rate tells us how old the nestlings are. And when we go backwards, so when they hatched and then go backwards from when they first laid eggs in their nest sites, we looked at over 1,200 first breeding attempts. And what we found is that eagles over an 18-year period that were nesting along the Great Lakes shorelines or tributaries open to Great Lakes fish runs were nesting almost a day earlier per year over that time period. So we have one indicator of climate change effects. There's less ice on the lakes. We're seeing the eagles nest earlier. And so far, there's no impact to reproduction. The other thing that we've seen there's a rule in ecology called Bergmann's rule. So if the same animal lives in the north to the south in its range like bald eagles do, they're bigger in the north and smaller in the south. And we know the average female in Alaska is 15 pounds, the average female in Michigan is 12 pounds, and the average female in Florida is about 10 pounds. So that shows Bergmann's rule. If you're big, you retain heat. If you're small, you get rid of heat. So one of the other indicators we see of climate change is eagles that are nesting inland where it's getting warmer in Michigan are starting to become smaller when we measured them over the last 18 years. So a dual climate change indicator. So eagles are very, very sensitive. When we started cleaning up the Fish and Wildlife Service and the EPA and DNR and DEQ were cleaning up the Saginaw Bay, we saw that very quickly concentrations in PCBs started declining in those areas. Voyageurs National Park in Minnesota, when they stabilize the water levels, and if you have a lot of fluctuation in your water levels and your impoundments, it increases the methylation in mercury. When the International Joint Commission stabilized those water levels, the next year, the eagles at Voyageurs, which were 3 times higher in mercury levels than everywhere else in the Great Lakes, those levels came down and were the same as the rest of the Great Lakes, just by stabilizing the water levels. So they're a very, very sensitive indicator, being at the very top of the food chain.
The beginning of spring means it's time to go through the tackle box and get ready for the upcoming seasons. Here's some tips from fishing guide Mike Mladenik about topwater baits for bass.
When it comes to topwater fishing, every smallmouth fisherman or bass fisherman has their favorite topwater baits. That's good, but it's easy to get stuck in that rut where you're always using the same bait all the time. This is my favorite one. If I had to pick one when I'm fishing for smallmouth, it's a Hubs Chub. It's got a prop on it, got a lot of noise, got a rattle. I pop it, it drops vertically into the water, and I've got that shake. Most of the time, I can just annihilate the fish on this. I work it slow, I pop it, drops vertically. The red feather tail here, pop it again, it drops back down, drives the smallmouth nuts, but some days, they don't take it. What do I do then? Well, the first thing most people say, I'm gonna change color. You know, I'm gonna go to something that's color's not working. I don't change color, I go to a different type of bait, then I'll switch. I use a lot of poppers too, but you notice this popper, same thing. I've got some kind of hair on the tail, and I just short pop, it drops vertically again in the water, pop, drops vertically into the water. I play around with that. The 2 different types of baits, they're similar, but again, this has still got some rattle to it. Then I start experimenting with color. Before I change the color, I'll go to a different style of bait. Black bait. Wherever you're fishing, topwater, clear lake or river, Whenever it's overcast, maybe got a slight drizzle, I want to use a black bait. All those bright colors, white even, or that sounds good, but stay away from that. Low light conditions, even towards evening. Sometimes you're hitting them with a topwater. Maybe I'm using this orange all day long, and all of a sudden it gets a little dark towards evening. They stop hitting that orange, but I throw out a black bait, and all of a sudden they start hitting that. So even if you fish at night, you want to use black. And another thing, don't hesitate to downsize. Sometimes, you know, they just don't want to take that bait anyway. This popper might be great if they're somewhat aggressive, but you get a cold front, maybe a weather change or something. I'll even use a little tiny little popper like that, and I can catch 20-inch fish with that too. So vary with your different size of the bait. Yeah, you can play with a different color, but size, action, there's a lot of variables in the type of bait that you choose for the day.
Well, that's about it for this week. I'll leave you now with some of the sights and sounds of spring in the UP.